thing. So when you're saying taxes, you're referring to tariffs on imports, which is how the federal government made its money. We actually have a record of most of the foreign goods imported into the United States just before the war in the annual report of the Chamber of Commerce of the state of New York. The report shows that from July 1859 to June 1860, $233.7 million worth of foreign goods were brought into the port of New York, of which $203.4 million were subject to tariffs. During that same time period, all other American ports combined took in just $128.5 million worth of goods, of which $76.5 million were subject to tariffs. The numbers don't lie. New York merchants were single-handedly paying 63.5% of all the federal government's revenue that year. And it wasn't just some anomaly. New York had provided nearly 2/3 of the government's revenue in the previous 5 years as well. That city was the government's biggest cash cow by a huge margin, followed only distantly by Boston in second place and New Orleans in third.
The southern states before the war in 1861 had the highest per capita income in the United States. They were net producers, the net consumers of public welfare. When I say that, I'm talking about things like tariffs and the benefits of federal spending, internal improvements. Those things went more to northern states than they did to southern states. Now, of course, people will pull out data and say, no, McClanahan, you're wrong. Look at this data from these ports here in New York. Look at this tariff data. Look at all this economic data. The North was paying more in taxes than the South. Well, they had more people. But not just that. You're not looking at the entire picture. Southerners, per capita, were paying more, you see. They had to pay more because the economic disparity was not that high between the two. And there were fewer people. So Southerners were generally paying more and getting less out of the general government than the North. In other words, the North was a net receiver of federal money, whereas the South was a net producer. So you had this situation, a very wealthy Southern section, and people recognized it. Now, a lot of that capital was tied up in slaves, but even outside of that, there was a really good article on the Abbeville Institute about this particular point. The South was still wealthier than the North. If you look at the value of farms for independent farmers, which, by the way, most Southerners were independent farmers. A very small percentage of the Southern population actually owned any slaves. So most Southerners were just in the same position as Northern farmers or Midwestern farmers. They were producing just like those people, and their farms were just as valuable, if not more valuable, than these other farms. And what did they not get? They didn't get any federally funded internal improvements. Nobody was going out and cutting canals for them based on federal dollars or putting in railroads or all these other things that, of course, Midwestern farmers were demanding. They weren't getting free land. I mean, you go out and look at how much land was being doled out in the West during this time period. They weren't getting that. In fact, if you go back and even look at George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, other people, they talked about land as a way to produce more, so people had to pay less taxes. But when you're basically giving the land away, well, you have a situation where those people are getting more from the federal government than they're getting in. And of course, the corruption would be rampant when you start looking at how this land was ultimately divided up. During the 1860s, when the Republicans controlled Congress, they just really started giving it away. And the people that were making the most out of it were northern corporations. They would set up basically dummy situations where they'd put a house on it, the Homestead Act. They'd stick a house out there. Nobody would live in it, but they'd say it's ours, and they would get the best land, the choice land, so they could cut a railroad through there. And then they'd sell off what they didn't need. So there's a tremendous amount of corruption. Then, of course, you factor in the tariff, and what the tariff does do, it protects northern manufacturers, and those northern manufacturers would then make a lot of money, not just on the revenue of a tariff, but because people would be forced to buy northern goods. You see, it's a form of corporate welfare. So the North was a net benefit from federal activity, where the South was paying taxes and not getting much out of it. Now, you can say, well, but wait a second here. They could sell their cotton to the North. They could sell their cotton anywhere. It didn't matter. They could sell their cotton to Europe. They could sell their cash crops, whether it was cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, fruits, vegetables, grains. They could sell any of that anywhere they wanted. And they didn't have to have a situation where we had unfair prices, higher prices being paid for manufactured goods because the tariff was higher. So that's the whole thing as well. It wasn't just about the revenue being produced from the tariff itself. It was also about the cost of goods and the net benefit. So you see, there is a winner and loser when you start talking about federal policy.